Hello everyone and welcome back. Sorry. Hello everyone and welcome back. Looks like I didn't have the audio on. So this is our last chapter, last week. Yay! We are going to be covering Chapter 15 out of Wolfbook, which is classroom assessment, grading, and standardized testing. And so as always, we have a few objectives for this week, and they are to distinguish between evaluation, measurement, and assessment, including the functions of each, to distinguish between norm reference and criterion reference assessments, to describe how reliability, validity, and absence of bias are used to understand and judge assessments, to describe two kinds of traditional classroom testing, and how authentic assessment can be used as an alternative to traditional assessments, to describe the effects of grading on students and the types of strategies teachers can use to communicate to parents about grades, to explain how to interpret common standardized test scores, things like percentile rank, staining, grade equivalent, and scale score, and identify some of the current issues in standardized testing. So let's start with some basics of assessment. First, we need to understand the difference between these two terms of measurement and assessment. Measurement is the description of an event or characteristic and using numbers. And then assessment includes measurement, but it also includes all kinds of ways to sample and observe students' skills, knowledge, and abilities. So measurement is a type, or assessment includes measurements. We will leave it at that. Okay, so there are four major types of assessment, and these are things that you should know, especially if you're going into the teaching profession. And the first type is diagnostic, which is gathering and evaluation of detailed information for providing appropriate scaffolding. Formative assessment shows where students are in their learning, and this is essential to good instruction. So if we don't know where students are at, we really can't help them get where we want them to be. And then there's summative assessment, which takes place at set intervals, and it relates to progress in knowledge acquisition. So summative assessment is typically what we would think of when we think of assessment. So it would be things like exams or the final project, things like that. And then lastly, we have evaluative assessment, which is judgment on the instruction. So we're going to spend the majority of this section of the lecture on formative and summative assessment. So there are many types of formative assessment. So again, formative assessment are things that we do to try to evaluate where students are at in their learning. So for example, I actually use the discussion boards for that. But in a traditional face-to-face classroom, you would have things like observations. So simply watching students to see whether or not they seem to be getting it. You can question students. So asking questions, trying to prod, see where they're at, to evaluate the depths of their understanding, things like discussion. You can do things like exit and admit slips. So this would be, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, where an instructor would actually give you a slip of paper with a question on it, and then when you leave class, you would provide them with that. Related to that idea is this learning and response logs. So you would present the information and have students respond at different intervals to what's happening. And we're actually going to try a kind of modified version of that today. So that'll be something different, just in the course on a sparky note, I guess. You can also use things like graphic organizers to see where students are at. So can they fill in the graph that you've presented with the appropriate information? You can do things like practice presentations, visual representations. You can use individual whiteboards where all students would have a little whiteboard and they would respond to you. You can use constructive quizzes So using the quiz to see how they're doing. So in our class, we actually use a modified concept of that. It's modified in the sense that it is used with the use of technology and it is used online. So I use the interactive quizzes, or rather you use them to see where you are at in your learning. But if we were in a face-to-face class or in a K through 12 situation, I might use quizzes to see where you're at. And then if 80% of you were not getting the concept, then it is on me to reteach. Other forms of assessment includes things like think, pair, share, where you would pose a question and then have students think about it and then pair up with another student, discuss it, and then have those students share with the entire class or in a larger group. You can do things like thumbs up, thumbs down. So did you get it? Yes. Did you not get it? No. So those kinds of things. You just try to see where they're at, and so you know where they're at, where you want them to be. So if they're not where you think they should be, then you need to address that using modified instruction. Okay, so we're gonna, oops, this is actually out of order. So I'm gonna slide through a little bit here. Pay no attention to that. We're gonna come back to that slide. So let's talk a little bit about summative assessment, and then we'll go back and look at that little quiz that I just breezed through. So summative assessment is introduced at the beginning of a course, if it is a part of a course. So we know at the beginning of a course what our summative assessments are going to be. For example, in this course, we had the midterm, the motivational interview project, the final exam, and then the teaching philosophy paper. So a summative assessment has a cumulative aspect. So it's typically done at the end of an instructional unit or at the end of multiple units. So what has been learned over this period of time, and then you're evaluated on it. So it demonstrates understanding and knowledge acquisition. It should be authentic. It could be customized. So you might have different exams for different subjects for different students. And if it is a more authentic type of assessment, then it should be scored with a rubric. So I'm thinking of things like the projects, right? So the 2 papers in here, you should have a rubric for your evaluation of students, and also it provides students with a map for how to get the project done. So did I cover everything that they are expecting to be covered? So some types of summative assessment are a project, a paper, an exam, a portfolio. So let me just go back and we're going to look at this formative and summative assessment again. So I just want you to think about these questions and whether or not, sorry, not questions. Look at these statements and decide whether or not they are formative or summative. So a state test to measure a level of achievement on state content standards. So thinking about whether that would be used to say, oh, over this period of time has a standard, has content been met? Have these people achieved what they should have? And so that would make that one a summative assessment. A state test that measure levels of achievement on state content standards used by the district teachers and teams to determine program effectiveness. So it says summative here. I would actually argue that it would be formative simply because it's going to be used to determine the program effectiveness. With this idea, I think implied there is that you're going to go back and do something about it. The third one is a state test that identifies percentages of students meeting performance standards on state content standards used by the district teacher and teams to develop programs, interventions for groups or individuals. So that one is more explicit, so definitely formative. And we have district benchmark, interim, or common assessment that measures levels of achievement towards state content standards. It's used by the district teachers and teams to determine program effectiveness. So the answer there is summative. And then we have classroom assessment that measures levels of achievement on learning targets taught. It's used by teachers to determine report card grades. So that would definitely be summative. The last example is classroom assessment used to diagnose student strengths and areas needing reteaching. Used by teachers and teams to revise teaching plans for next year or semester. So that one would be formative. So I would say that most of the time in education when we're talking about formative or summative, we're focused in on the classroom. And so these actually provide broader examples of the differences between formative and summative assessment. And I think that's important to recognize. Okay. So we're going to do, again, I told you we were going to do a learning and response log for today, or for your chapter 15, because I'm actually going to break this particular chapter up into a couple of lectures. So the first reflective activity that we're going to do is you are going to imagine yourself as a first-year teacher making the decision on what kind of formative assessment to use in your classroom. Compare and contrast to the following in terms of strengths and weaknesses. So again, we have the list that was primarily from observation or from formative assessment. So observations, questioning, discussion, exit admin slips, learning and response logs, graphic organizers, practice presentations, visual representations, individual whiteboards, constructive quizzes, think, pair, share, thumbs up and thumbs down. So it might be more useful to take two that are fairly complex in doing this, but certainly not necessary. So again, compare and contrast two of the terms listed, or two of the types of formative assessment listed. Okay, so here's a question for you. You'll fill out an end of the year, end of the term course evaluation form on this class. So will that be formative or summative? And then how could I make that a formative assessment? So just additional thought on that. All right, so I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes here covering some of the groundwork on the basics of assessment. So tests. We want to deal with three terms here. One is test reliability. So this is the likelihood that scores remain constant across time and conditions. And so basically that they will yield stable and consistent results. So if tests are unreliable, then that's an indicator that there's something wrong. And then we have test validity, and this is the idea that of whether or not the test is measuring what it is intended to measure. So sometimes what happens is a test is developed and we think our intent was to measure Johnny's ability to understand Romeo and Juliet. But what happens is that test is done, it's written, and we can no longer say that it was about Romeo and Juliet because we inadvertently decided to include something about this is getting in my Wayback Machine, but it includes a sitcom episode that was based on The Taming of the Shrew, and you're trying to get them to do this compare and contrast. And so pretty soon what happens is your evaluation is actually more focused on this other thing than their understanding of Romeo and Juliet. All right, so last thing is absence of bias. So bias occurs when tests include material that offends or unfairly penalizes a group of students because of the student's gender, socioeconomic status, race, or ethnicity. So what can happen when tests are written is because there is this assumption of normality in terms of being white and middle class, that we may make assumptions about what students know. So you can have cultural references that some students may not be aware of just because of who they are and where they're from. So, unfortunately, this issue has been known for a considerable amount of time. It's just first started getting noticed in the early 70s. But unfortunately, cultural fair tests have not proved to solve the problem of assessment bias. So there is apparently inherently in this process of trying to create a normative idea of where students should be at, there's some cultural bias there. So I think it's probably gotten better, but we still have a ways to go. All right, so I am actually going to cut this lecture off and start off again at this slide here. So classroom assessment testing is where we will pick up for the next one.